The California sun beat down hard on the sprawling grounds of Camp Pendleton. The air shimmered with heat waves that made the horizon dance, and the faint smell of gun oil hung thick around the firing range. A group of fresh-faced Marines gathered in clusters, their laughter ringing out over the rhythmic clatter of rifles being checked, cleaned, and snapped back together. It was range day, and to them, it was more than training. It was competition, an unspoken challenge between squads to prove who had the sharpest eye, the steadiest hand, the truest shot. Among the chatter, one figure seemed out of place. Thomas Keene walked steadily across the gravel, his steps unhurried but purposeful. His boots crunched softly, drawing the attention of a few curious glances. He wore no uniform, only a simple button-up shirt tucked into faded jeans and a ball cap pulled low against the sun. His hair, silvered by time, peeked out beneath the brim, and deep lines marked the corners of his face. "Who's the old guy?" one recruit whispered, nudging his friend. "Probably a visitor. Family Day isn't until next month, though." Thomas didn't answer the stares. He had learned long ago that silence carried more weight than explanation. His eyes, sharp and clear despite the years, swept across the range with a familiarity that unsettled some of the younger Marines. He didn't look like he was sightseeing. He looked like a man coming home. At the far end of the firing line, a cluster of recruits spotted him approaching and immediately broke into grins. One, tall and broad-shouldered with the brash confidence of youth, stepped forward. "You lost, sir?" he asked, half-joking. "This area's for shooters, not spectators." The group chuckled. Thomas's lips curved in the faintest smile. "I know where I am," he replied calmly. His voice carried the gravelly edge of age, but underneath it was a tone that made the recruit hesitate. Another Marine, younger and eager to impress, leaned his rifle against his shoulder. "You here to watch the kids shoot, old-timer?" he teased. "Maybe share a story about the good old days?" The laughter grew louder, emboldened by their numbers. Thomas didn't flinch. He simply nodded once, as if the question required no further answer. His silence unsettled them more than if he had barked back. But then he kept walking straight toward the instructor's table, where the rifles for the long-range trials were laid out. That's when the mocking laughter shifted to genuine surprise. "Wait, is he serious?" one recruit whispered. The instructor, a grizzled gunnery sergeant who had seen his share of brash kids and broken egos, looked up as Thomas approached. He studied the man for a moment, recognizing something in his carriage, the way his shoulders squared, the steady focus in his eyes. This wasn't just some curious retiree wandering in. "You Keene?" the gunnery sergeant asked. Thomas nodded. "Thought so. Heard you might be showing up today." The recruits blinked in confusion. The gunnery sergeant didn't treat this stranger like a nuisance. There was respect in his voice, the kind that wasn't given lightly. Thomas said nothing more, just gave the faintest smile, as though he'd been through this before. His gaze shifted to the far end of the range, where steel targets gleamed faintly in the haze. The longest stood so far out that most recruits had trouble even spotting it without optics. "Don't tell me he's here for that," one recruit muttered, incredulous. "That's a mile-and-a-half shot," another added. "Even our best guys struggle to get close?" The gunnery sergeant folded his arms. "That's exactly what he's here for." The whispers grew into murmurs, disbelief spreading quickly. One of the recruits scoffed outright. "With respect, Gunny, no way. That shot can't be done. Not even by half the snipers on base." Thomas finally spoke, his tone low and steady. "Impossible's just a word for the impatient." The line fell silent. For the first time, the recruits realized the man in front of them wasn't there to tell stories or to relive faded memories. He was here with a purpose. A purpose that might just append everything they thought they knew about the limits of a rifle and the man behind it. The gunnery sergeant gave Thomas a small nod, then turned to the recruits. "Pay attention, boys. You might just learn something today." Thomas moved toward the bench, ignoring the mutters that followed. He wasn't here to prove them wrong. He was here for the challenge, the quiet test between man, machine, and distance. Every step he took toward the firing line carried the weight of years of discipline, training, and experience the young Marines couldn't yet imagine. And though many of them still smirked, dismissing him as nothing more than an old veteran clinging to faded glory, something in the air had shifted. The laughter was quieter now, edged with curiosity, even unease. As Thomas set his cap down on the bench and began to roll his sleeves, the recruits leaned in despite themselves. They had no idea that before the day was over, the man they mocked would etch his name into their memory forever. The recruits still buzzed with whispers after Thomas Keene stepped up to the line. To them, the idea of an old man attempting the Corps' toughest shot wasn't just unusual, it was absurd. Their world was built on hard training, fresh reflexes, and the belief that youth gave them an edge. They measured strength in push-ups, speed in sprints, and skill in timed drills. By those standards, the man before them didn't belong. Thomas didn't seem to notice their doubt. Or maybe he simply didn't care. He moved with a quiet steadiness, studying the weapon laid out for him. It wasn't the exact rifle he'd used in the service, but the mechanics were familiar. His hands ran along the stock, fingers brushing the bolt and scope as though reacquainting with an old friend. "Sir, with respect." One recruit finally spoke up, unable to hold back his disbelief. "That shot's not for beginners. Even the best on this base rarely tag the steel at that distance." The others nodded, smirks creeping across their faces. "Yeah," another added. "Wind, humidity, mirage, it's impossible. Nobody does it first try." Thomas looked up from the rifle. His eyes, pale blue and sharp as glass, met the recruits. "If you believe it can't be done," he said quietly, "then you've already lost before you start." The words hung heavy in the air. It wasn't arrogance. It was conviction. The kind born from battles fought not just against enemies, but against doubt itself. The gunnery sergeant, arms folded, stepped closer. "Listen up," he barked to the recruits. "This man's not just another visitor. He wore the eagle, globe, and anchor before most of you were born. He's seen more dust, mud, and smoke than you can imagine. So show some respect." Some recruits straightened, embarrassed. Others exchanged uneasy looks. Respect was one thing, but records were another. Thomas set the rifle down gently, then adjusted the sling with slow precision. His movements weren't rushed. He had nothing to prove in haste. Every adjustment was deliberate, a reflection of discipline carved into muscle memory long ago. "Sir?" a younger Marine muttered under his breath, though loud enough to be heard. "Times changed since your day. Rifles, optics, ballistics, they're different now. Shooting like this isn't the same as in the old wars." Thomas paused, then chuckled softly. "The tools may change," he said, "but the shooter doesn't. Breathing, patience, focus, that never changes." The recruits fell silent again. Some smirked less now, though their disbelief hadn't completely faded. They simply couldn't reconcile the image before them. A silver-haired veteran in jeans about to attempt what their finest sharpshooters struggled to achieve. The gunnery sergeant leaned down beside Thomas, speaking low so only a few nearby could hear. "They don't know who you were, Keene. Maybe that's for the best. Let them see it for themselves." Thomas gave a faint nod. That's the way it should be. He picked up the rifle once more, adjusting the bipod, checking the chamber, then glancing at the far horizon. To most of the recruits, the target might as well have been invisible. The distance was intimidating, the shimmering air deceptive. Yet Thomas studied it like a man who had all the time in the world. "Sir," one of the bolder recruits said suddenly, "if you miss, no one's going to hold it against you. We know it can't be done." This time, Thomas laughed. It wasn't mocking, but it carried the weight of someone who had heard those words before, in darker, deadlier places. "That's what they always say before the work gets done," he answered. The gunnery sergeant barked a sharp order to the line. "Stand back. Let him work." The recruits reluctantly stepped aside, though many craned their necks for a better view. They didn't want to miss this. Whether it ended in failure or not, the moment already felt different, charged with something none of them could quite name. Thomas lowered himself into the prone position with ease that surprised them. There was no stiffness, no hesitation in his movements. His body aligned behind the rifle, as though the years had peeled away, leaving only the Marine who had once lived and breathed this skill. Behind him, whispers carried. "No way he even comes close. He's wasting everyone's time." But beneath those voices, a quieter murmur began to spread curiosity. The instructor called out the wind reading, his voice steady, professional. Thomas listened, but his focus remained on the flag's downrange, the ripples telling him more than numbers alone could. He had always trusted instinct as much as calculation. When he settled the stock into his shoulder, the atmosphere shifted. Even the recruits felt it, though they couldn't explain why. The range, once filled with chatter, seemed to shrink into silence. It wasn't respect yet, it was anticipation. For the first time that day, the recruits weren't laughing. They were watching. And deep inside, some of them wondered if the impossible was about to change meaning right before their eyes. The recruits had seen long shots before, but nothing like this. The target sat on the far edge of the range, a steel silhouette so distant it shimmered against the horizon like a mirage. It was hard enough to see with the naked eye, let alone strike with a bullet. At nearly 2 miles away, the distance mocked their training, mocked their confidence. Most of them had tried the challenge before, if only for bragging rights, but each had come away humbled. Today would be no different. They thought, except that it wasn't one of them behind the rifle. One by one, earlier that morning, Marines had stepped up to take their shot. The process was almost ritual. Scope adjustment, slow breaths, careful squeeze, then the hollow disappointment of seeing dirt kick up short or wide of the plate. Some hit close, enough to draw oohs and ahs from their buddies, but close didn't matter. The record board had one empty space at the top for a reason. Nobody had ever landed that shot. As Thomas Keene settled behind the weapon, the memories of those misses hung heavy in the recruits' minds. To them, the rifle wasn't a tool anymore. It was a taunt, daring them to believe they could push past limits. But Thomas didn't look at it that way. To him, the rifle was familiar, steady, as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. He had spent countless hours behind weapons in sand, jungle, and snow, listening to the wind whisper across the barrel, watching the way a distant flag rippled before each squeeze of the trigger. He knew that distance was never the enemy. It was patience that made or broke a shot. The recruits leaned on the rail, muttering under their breath. He can't even see the target. Even the instructors don't hit it half the time. Bet he doesn't even get close. But beneath their doubt was a thin thread of nervous energy. Something about the way Thomas moved, deliberate, calm, unshaken by the whispers, made them uneasy. He reached for the spotting scope first, adjusting its focus until the steel silhouette resolved clearly. His eyes narrowed, tracing the faint distortions of heat rising off the ground. Mirage, they called it. To rookies, it was just another frustration. To veterans like Thomas, it was information, a map of how air and light bent across distance. The gunnery sergeant, standing just behind him, called out, "Wind 5 knots, quartering right." Thomas barely nodded. He had already felt it on his cheek, already seen it in the lazy flutter of the far-off range flags. He trusted the numbers, but he trusted his instincts more. For a long moment, he didn't move. He just watched. The recruits shifted impatiently, mistaking his stillness for hesitation. "What's he waiting for?" One whispered. Another shrugged. "Probably stalling. Doesn't want to embarrass himself." But the sergeant knew better. He had seen that kind of stillness before. Not hesitation calibration. Thomas finally lowered his eye to the rifle's scope. The world shrank into a tunnel, and in that tunnel, there was only the target. He made small, precise adjustments to the elevation and windage, then rested his cheek against the stock. His breathing slowed. In, out, each breath a metronome, syncing body and weapon. The recruits fell quiet, caught in the gravity of the moment. Their earlier smirks faded. Even those who doubted leaned forward, unwilling to look away. Through the scope, the target was nothing more than a speck of steel surrounded by haze. Yet Thomas locked onto it with the calm assurance of a man who had stared down harder sights in harder places. His finger rested on the trigger, not tense, just there waiting for the perfect moment when breath, heartbeat, and wind aligned. The silence was thick now. No one dared speak. The valley stretched endlessly before them, the heat shimmering like a living thing. In the distance, a hawk drifted lazily on the thermal, its wings barely moving. Thomas noticed it and let the image drift away. Distractions didn't matter. There was only the shot. The sergeant gave a final nod. "Whenever you're ready, Keen." Thomas didn't answer. He didn't need to. His entire being was already answering. His exhale slowed long and steady until it faded into stillness. His world narrowed to the crosshairs, the rise of the wind flag, the subtle pulse in his fingertips. And then, with a squeeze so smooth it seemed almost effortless, he sent the round downrange. The crack echoed across the valley, rolling like thunder against the hills. Every Marine on the line froze, eyes darting to the spotting scope, waiting. Seconds stretched into eternity as the bullet carved through the air. They had seen this moment countless times before, always ending the same way, with disappointment, with the dull thud of a miss. But this time felt different. The recruits leaned in, hearts thudding faster than they admitted. And then the spotter's voice shattered the silence. The valley swallowed the rifle's crack, the sound rolling across the dusty hills until it seemed to echo back on itself. The round was already cutting through the air, but for the recruits, time stretched unnaturally long. Their eyes flicked between the distant target and the spotter scope, waiting for the verdict. The spotter, a seasoned corporal with years of range duty, pressed his eye tight against the glass. His breathing quickened. He had watched hundreds of attempts, watched bullets tumble, drift, and vanish against the desert wind. But this one felt different from the moment it left the barrel. Come on, one recruit whispered, leaning so close he nearly bumped the corporal. The corporal didn't answer. His hands tightened on the scope. For a second, it seemed like nothing would happen, like every other failed attempt. And then, a faint spark of light blinked off the steel silhouette. The corporal jerked back, stunned. He blinked, checked again, then shouted, his voice raw. "Hit! Dead center!" The range exploded. Gasps, curses, disbelief, it all tumbled out at once. Some recruits clutched their helmets. Others threw their hands in the air. The impossible had been done. The steel plate still quivered faintly from the impact, a soundless echo of proof against the horizon. Thomas lifted his head from the rifle. Slowly, deliberately, he removed his ear protection and set it beside him. His expression didn't change. No grin, no boast. Just the calm of a man who had expected nothing less. "That'll do," he said softly. The gunnery sergeant let out a bark of laughter, shaking his head. Damn right, that'll do. But the recruits were nearly speechless. The same Marines who had mocked him minutes earlier now stood frozen, faces pale with disbelief. For them, the range had always been a place of failure, a reminder of limits. And here was a man old enough to be their grandfather, rewriting the board with one squeeze of the trigger. A younger Marine finally found his voice. How the hell did he do that? No one answered. Because the truth was, none of them could explain it. Thomas sat back, stretching his shoulders as if he'd just finished a casual chore. To him, the shot wasn't spectacle. It was work done correctly, no more, no less. The corporal still stared through the spotting scope, shaking his head. Cleanest hit I've ever seen, he muttered. The gunnery sergeant turned to the recruits, his eyes fierce. Remember this. You doubted him. You doubted the shot. You doubted the possibility. What you just saw wasn't luck, it was skill. Decades of it. That's what separates the good from the great. Some recruits shuffled awkwardly, shame prickling in their chests. They remembered their laughter, their mocking words. Now they couldn't even meet Thomas's gaze. But Thomas didn't look at them with anger or triumph. Instead, he studied their faces, reading the mix of awe and confusion. He had seen those looks before, young men learning hard lessons faster than they wanted. One Marine finally swallowed his pride and stepped forward. Sir, I owe you an apology. We didn't think you could do it. Thomas tilted his head, then gave a small nod. You shouldn't have thought about me at all. You should have thought about the shot. Doubt's not in the target. It's in you. The Marine's ears reddened, but he nodded, humbled. Around them, the recruits began buzzing again, this time not with laughter, but with questions. What scope adjustment did he use? How did he read the wind like that? Did he memorize the distance before? The gunnery sergeant raised a hand, silencing the flood. One question at a time. You'll get your answers if you pay attention. Thomas stood slowly, brushing the dust from his jeans. His joints cracked faintly, a reminder of his years, but he moved with the composure of a man who had just walked through fire untouched. Do it again. One recruit blurted, unable to hold back. Sir, hit it again. The sergeant barked, quiet. But even he was curious. One shot could be dismissed as luck by the stubborn. Two? That would be irrefutable. Thomas considered the request, then looked back at the target shimmering in the heat. He smiled faintly, then shook his head. One's enough, he said. The recruits groaned, some out of disappointment, others out of relief. Deep down, they knew the truth. They had witnessed something rare, something that didn't need repeating. The gunnery sergeant clapped Thomas on the shoulder. You just made my job harder. Every one of these kids is gonna think they can pull that shot now. Thomas chuckled softly. And let them try. Trying's how they'll learn. The sergeant grinned, then turned back to the recruits. All right, get your butts ready. You'll be back on the line soon enough. And maybe, just maybe, you'll remember what you saw today when you doubt yourselves. The recruits dispersed slowly, still casting backward glances at Thomas. For some, the sight of that hit burned into their memory as inspiration. For others, it was a bruise to their pride. But none would forget it. As the crowd thinned, Thomas stayed a moment longer at the bench, staring out at the target. His eyes softened, not with pride, but with memory. The shot had taken him back to nights in far-off places where a single bullet meant survival, where calm in chaos had saved lives. Today's hit wasn't about a record. It was about proving, if only to himself, that the fire hadn't gone out. He picked up his cap, dusted it off, and set it back on his head. The sergeant watched him go, a thoughtful look in his eyes. Hell of a Marine, he muttered under his breath. And though Thomas walked away quietly, the echo of his shot lingered. Not in the ringing steel, not in the record books, but in the minds of every young Marine who had just learned that the limits they clung to weren't limits at all. The range was never quiet. Normally, it carried the constant rhythm of shots, the shouted cadence of instructors, and the low rumble of Marines trading jokes. But after Thomas's shot, a strange silence lingered, thick and heavy. It was as though every man on that line needed time to believe what they had just witnessed. The steel silhouette, 2 miles out, still quivered faintly in the heat. Its ringing had long since died, but the memory of that sound, the clear, sharp confirmation of impact echoed in the minds of everyone present. For the younger recruits, it was a gut punch. They had grown up believing records belonged to legends in books, to names on plaques, not to men standing right beside them. And certainly not to an old veteran in plain clothes who had walked onto their range as quietly as a breeze. "Did you see it?" One recruit hissed, still leaning toward the corporal's spotting scope. "I saw it," the corporal muttered, shaking his head. "Clean hit. Dead center. No excuses. First try," another whispered. That was first try. The disbelief spread in ripples. The recruits had expected a miss, maybe even a total failure. Some had secretly hoped for it. But instead, Thomas Keene had done in one shot what they had all failed to achieve in dozens. The gunnery sergeant, arms crossed, allowed the silence to stretch before speaking. His voice cut through the haze like a blade. "Gentlemen," he said, "you just saw history. Etch it into your heads. Don't ever tell me something can't be done again." The recruits shifted, embarrassed. A few stared at their boots, unwilling to meet his eyes. The words they had spoken earlier mocking, dismissive, now seemed childish, almost shameful. But Thomas wasn't interested in their shame. He rose slowly from the bench, brushing the dust from his hands, and looked across the valley. To him, the moment wasn't about glory. It was about execution, discipline, and a reminder that mastery wasn't bound by age. One recruit, braver than the rest, stepped forward. "Sir," he stammered, how did you know?" Thomas studied the young man's face and replied in his calm, gravelly tone. "I didn't know. That's the point. You don't know until you try. But I trusted my training. Trusted the wind, the rifle, my breath. Doubt won't guide a bullet, son. Patience will." The recruit swallowed hard, nodding. His cheeks burned with both awe and humility. Around them, more voices chimed in. "What adjustments did you use? Did you read the mirage or the flags? Was it muscle memory or instinct?" Their words tumbled out in a rush, a hunger to understand what they had just seen. For the first time that day, the recruits weren't laughing. They were learning. The gunnery sergeant barked for order, but even he couldn't hide the smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He had known Thomas's reputation, had read enough reports and citations to respect the man long before this demonstration. Still, even he hadn't expected the shot to land so perfectly, so clean. "You all want answers?" The sergeant growled. "Then listen. What he just showed you isn't about formulas on a board. It's about discipline. Years of it. The kind you don't get in a week or a year. It's in how you breathe, how you think, how you don't let fear of failure own you." The recruits absorbed his words, but their eyes remained fixed on Thomas. He wasn't just a guest anymore. He was a standard, a living embodiment of what they could only aspire to. A murmur rose at the far end of the line. Other Marines, hearing the commotion, had gathered. News traveled fast on a base, and whispers had already begun to spread. "Old vet shattered the range record," they said. "Hit it first try." Thomas adjusted his cap, preparing to leave the bench. But before he could step away, one of the recruits blurted, "Do it again, sir." Prove it wasn't luck. A few others echoed the challenge, half eager, half desperate. They wanted to see lightning strike twice, wanted undeniable confirmation. The gunnery sergeant's glare shut them up fast, but Thomas only smiled faintly. "One shot's enough," he said. The words carried a weight that stilled even the boldest voices. One shot was enough. To demand more would cheapen it. He began walking toward the sergeant's table, but each step drew more eyes, more whispers. Marines who had laughed at him now moved aside respectfully, as if instinctively sensing they were in the presence of something they didn't fully understand. By the time Thomas reached the edge of the line, the chatter had shifted from disbelief to admiration. That was unreal. Never seen anything like it. Guy's a legend. But Thomas didn't bask in their words. He simply collected his belongings, nodding politely when someone offered congratulations. For him, the satisfaction wasn't in their awe, it was in knowing he still had the patience, the steadiness, the clarity to meet the challenge. The gunnery sergeant clapped him on the back. "Keen, you realize what you've just done, right? Every recruit here is going to chase that shot for the rest of their careers." Thomas chuckled softly. "Then I've given them something worth chasing." The sergeant grinned. "Damn right you have." As Thomas walked away from the line, the recruits stared after him. Some felt humbled, others inspired, but none were untouched. They had seen the impossible become possible with their own eyes, and the memory would follow them long after their time at Camp Pendleton ended. And behind them, the steel silhouette stood silent, a cold witness to the day an old veteran reminded the Marine Corps that limits were illusions, and that mastery, once earned, never truly faded. By evening, the range was buzzing like a kicked beehive. Word of the impossible shot had traveled far beyond the group of recruits who had witnessed it. In chow halls and barracks, in the motor pool and the armory, Marines spoke of it with the same breathless tone, usually reserved for combat stories or tall tales. "First try," one private swore, slamming his tray down for emphasis. Guy just sat down, lined it up, and bang. Dead center. 2 miles out. "No way," another muttered, shaking his head. "Nobody does that first try." He must have practiced, had it set up. But doubt was quickly silenced by those who had seen it firsthand. "I was on the spotting scope," Corporal Vega said, his voice tight with conviction. "It was clean. No fluke, no setup. Just skill." The argument spread, but at the heart of every conversation was the same conclusion. Something extraordinary had happened. For the recruits, the experience was more than rumor. It gnawed at them, lingering like a lesson they couldn't ignore. They remembered their laughter, their mocking words. And now they remembered the silence afterward, the way Thomas had looked at them, not with pride or anger, but with calm certainty. That night in the barracks, a few sat together in uneasy silence. Private Herrera finally broke it. "I can't stop thinking about it," he admitted. "We thought he was just some old guy with stories. But did you see the way he breathed before the shot? The way he didn't rush?" "Yeah," another said quietly. "I thought he was gonna miss, for sure. I even bet against him." No one laughed. They just sat, replaying the moment over and over. The next morning, the gunnery sergeant marched them back to the range. His expression was sharper than usual, his voice like gravel under boots. "Yesterday, you saw what discipline looks like," he barked. "Today, you're going to learn from it." The recruits exchanged puzzled glances, then stiffened when they saw Thomas already waiting at the bench, rifle in hand. He wasn't there to repeat the shot. His calm expression made that clear. He was there for something else. "Listen up," the sergeant growled. "This man doesn't need to prove anything. But you do. And he's going to help you understand what it takes. Thomas rose slowly, adjusting his cap, his weathered face unreadable. He studied the young Marines, their straightened backs and nervous eyes, and then he spoke. "You all think the shot was about me," he began. "It wasn't. It was about process, patience, fundamentals. That's what I'll teach. If you're willing to shut your mouths and listen." The recruits nodded eagerly, even the ones who had doubted him the loudest. So Thomas began. He didn't start with the rifle, or the scope, or even the wind. He started with breathing. "Your body's your first instrument," he explained. "Doesn't matter how good your rifle is if your chest is rattling like a drum. Control that first, and you control the rest." The recruits lay prone, practicing slow, deliberate breaths. Thomas moved among them, correcting posture with a gentle tap, reminding them to loosen their grip, to let the rifle rest rather than wrestle with it. "Stop fighting the shot," he told one Marine. "You're not forcing it. You're letting it happen." They listened, rapt, because every word came from a man who had proved his mastery. Hours passed, the desert sun climbing high. The recruits sweated, cursed under their breath, but they focused like never before. They weren't just shooting now, they were learning, truly learning. By midday, small improvements began to show. Groups tightened. Misses turned into near misses. And when a steel plate rang faintly in the distance, a cheer rose from the line. Thomas didn't smile, but his eyes softened. He had seen young Marines transform before raw clay shaped by discipline. This was no different. During a break, Private Herrera approached him, nervously clearing his throat. "Sir, yesterday, I laughed at you. I didn't think you'd even hit the target. I was wrong. And I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Thomas regarded him for a long moment, then nodded. "Don't waste breath on apologies. Spend it on focus. Every doubt you carry is weight you don't need." Herrera swallowed hard, then nodded with determination. By the end of the day, the recruits were exhausted, but alive with a new fire. They didn't see Thomas as just an old veteran anymore. He had become something else, an anchor, a living reminder that greatness wasn't about age or bravado, but about mastery forged over time. When the gunnery sergeant finally dismissed them, the recruits lingered, hesitant to leave. One by one, they shook Thomas's hand, their respect genuine now, not forced. As the last recruit walked away, the sergeant approached Thomas. "You've lit a fire in them," he said quietly. Thomas shrugged. "All I did was remind them what's possible." The sergeant studied him for a moment, then chuckled. "Maybe so, but I'll tell you this, your shot's already a legend around here. By next week, every Marine on this base will know your name." Thomas glanced back at the distant target, shimmering in the desert haze. A legend? Perhaps. But for him, it was never about records or fame. It was about the craft, the discipline, and passing on what he could before time finally caught up with him. He lifted his rifle case, nodded once to the sergeant, and walked toward the setting sun. Behind him, the whispers grew louder, the legend spreading with every retelling. And somewhere deep inside, Thomas felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had left more than a mark on steel. He had left one on the hearts of those who would carry the torch after him. By the third day, Thomas's name had reached ears far beyond the recruits who had witnessed his shot. The Marine Corps had always thrived on stories tales of grit, bravery, and impossible feats that became part of its culture. And this story of an old veteran shattering the range record on his very first try spread like wildfire through the base. It wasn't just whispered in chow halls anymore. It was spoken openly in the command offices, carried from staff sergeants to captains, from captains to majors. Each retelling grew sharper, not exaggerated, but emphasized. First shot. 2 miles. Dead center. By the time the battalion commander heard it, The story had already taken on the weight of legend. Colonel Richardson, a hard-edged officer with decades of service himself, summoned the gunnery sergeant to his office. The sergeant stood stiffly at attention, his jaw tight. He had expected this. "Gunny," Richardson said, his tone calm but edged with curiosity. "I hear one of your guests broke the range record. An old veteran. First try. Care to explain?" "Yes, sir," the sergeant replied. "Name's Thomas Keene, retired Marine sniper, Vietnam era. Shot the steel at 2 miles on his first attempt. Clean hit. I had it confirmed by my corporal on the spotting scope." Richardson leaned back, steepling his fingers. "And you're certain this wasn't a stunt? No tricks?" "None, sir. I'd stake my career on it." The colonel studied him for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "Very well. Arrange for Mr. Keene to meet me tomorrow morning. If half of what I've heard is true, I want to shake his hand." The sergeant saluted, hiding a flicker of satisfaction. That evening, Thomas sat alone on a bench outside the barracks, the desert wind tugging at his cap. He had noticed the whispers growing. The way more Marines saluted him now, even though he wasn't in uniform. Respect had shifted into reverence. It was a strange weight, one he hadn't sought. Private Herrera approached hesitantly, hands shoved in his pockets. "Sir," he began, "they're saying the colonel wants to meet you." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "That so?" "Yes, sir. Whole base is talking about it. Some say you might get your name on the official records." Thomas chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Records fade. What matters is whether you remember what you learned out there." Herrera flushed but nodded firmly. "I won't forget, sir. None of us will." Thomas gave him a rare smile, brief but genuine. Then the shot did its job. The next morning, Thomas stood in the colonel's office, cap in hand. Richardson rose from behind his desk, his posture formal, but his eyes warm with respect. "Mr. Keene," the colonel said, extending his hand, "it's an honor." Thomas shook it firmly. "Colonel, word of your shot has reached half the base already. I had to see the man for myself." "Sit, please." Thomas lowered himself into the chair, his movements deliberate, steady. Richardson studied him, taking in the weathered face, the calm eyes. "Tell me something. Why did you take that shot? You didn't come here to prove anything, yet you've turned the place upside down." Thomas leaned back slightly, his voice low. "I didn't come to prove. I came to teach." Those boys needed a reminder that limits aren't as solid as they think, that patience and discipline outlast age and doubt. The shot was just a way of showing it. Richardson nodded slowly, spoken like a true Marine. For a moment, silence hung in the office. Then the colonel leaned forward. "I intend to recommend your shot for official recognition. It may take time, paperwork, but something like this deserves to be recorded. The Corps thrives on legends like yours." Thomas gave a faint smile. "Legends don't belong to men, Colonel. They belong to those who carry them forward." Richardson chuckled softly. "Maybe so. But you've given these young Marines a story they'll tell their whole lives. That matters more than you know." Later that day, Thomas returned to the range, not to fire another shot, but to watch. The recruits were lined up, their rifles steady, their breathing controlled. He could see the difference already, the care in their posture, the patience in their trigger squeeze. The gunnery sergeant approached, folding his arms. "You've changed them," he said simply. Thomas's eyes stayed on the recruits. "They changed themselves. I just lit the match." One by one, the rifles fired. Steel rang at shorter distances, not 2 miles, but still hard enough to challenge them. Each hit was met with quiet satisfaction, not cocky grins. They were learning. The sergeant glanced at Thomas. "You may not want the recognition, but you've earned it. Hell, 4 generals could shut down this whole unit tomorrow, and they'd still remember your shot. Thomas gave a soft chuckle. Generals or not, the corps will keep moving. All I did was remind them of who they are. That night, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned a bruised shade of purple, Thomas walked alone along the range. The steel silhouette still stood 2 miles out, battered by years of attempts, scarred by thousands of rounds. But on its center was a fresh mark, a dent deeper than the rest, catching the last light of the day. He stopped and stared at it, not with pride, but with quiet reflection. The shot was already echoing beyond him, woven into the corps' living story. He knew his name might never matter, but the lesson would. For Thomas, that was enough. Sunlight filtered through the sparse clouds above Camp Pendleton, casting long shadows across the dusty firing range. The air was still, carrying only the faint smell of spent gunpowder and the warm scent of the desert soil. Thomas Keene stood near his truck, rifle case in hand, his cap pulled low against the sun. The past few days had been extraordinary, a flurry of sights, sounds, and reactions that seemed almost surreal. The base was alive with talk of his impossible shot. Recruits paused mid-drill to glance his way, whispers following him like a shadow. In the mess hall, older Marines repeated the story with awe. First try. 2 miles. Dead center. And he didn't even flinch. The legend had grown with each retelling, but Thomas remained undistracted, calm as if none of it mattered. Private Herrera approached him quietly, hesitant but determined. "Sir, I just want to say—" "Thank you," he began, voice cracking slightly. "You reminded us what we can do, what we should aim for. And I'll never forget it." Thomas studied the young Marine, his blue eyes clear and steady. "Don't thank me," he said softly. "Thank yourself. You'll carry this shot in your mind every time you doubt yourself. That's the real lesson." Herrera nodded, swallowing hard. "We won't forget, sir." Other recruits lingered nearby, hesitant to speak, but eager to offer quiet nods of respect. Even those who had laughed at him in the first moments of arrival now approached with admiration in their eyes. It wasn't just awe, they understood something deeper: discipline, patience, mastery, and humility. The gunnery sergeant stepped up beside Thomas. "You've left a mark here, Keene. Not on the steel, not just on the range record, but on all of them. Every Marine who saw that shot is going to carry it forward." Thomas nodded slightly. "That's the point. Not the record, not the attention, but the reminder of what's possible when you focus, when you train, and when you respect the craft." A convoy of vehicles rolled past the range in the distance, their engines rumbling softly. Somewhere beyond the desert hills, life would continue. Trains of supply trucks, convoys of Marines heading off base, the ordinary rhythm of service. But the impact of that single bullet, fired with precision and patience, would ripple far longer than any of them could measure. Colonel Richardson had arranged a formal acknowledgement for Thomas's feat, and a small ceremony had already taken place in the base auditorium. A certificate, a handshake, and words of recognition had been offered, but Thomas accepted none of the fanfare. He never had. He didn't need it. He had demonstrated what mattered most: mastery, focus, and the quiet power of experience. As he approached his truck, he paused for a final look at the range. The steel target gleamed faintly in the afternoon light, battered from countless past attempts, but now marked indelibly by one perfect impact. He could almost see the echo of the round as it flew through the air, cutting a line of possibility through doubt. The recruits had returned to their drills, but many stole glances at him, silently memorizing the stance, the calm posture, the patience that had guided that shot. Thomas didn't wave, didn't call out. His presence alone was enough to impress the lesson on them. A young corporal, one of the instructors who had watched the shot through the spotting scope, walked alongside him for a moment. "Keen, I've seen a lot in my career," he said quietly. "But I've never seen a Marine move the entire unit with a single round. That's exceptional." Thomas allowed a small smile, faint but genuine. "Exceptional isn't the goal," he replied. "The goal is to remind those who follow that limits are often imaginary, that you measure yourself not against others, but against what you can achieve if you focus." The corporal nodded, understanding. There was a lesson in there far beyond marksmanship. It was about life, discipline, and honor. Thomas finally reached his truck. He paused, hand on the handle, taking one last look over his shoulder. The sun was lower now, golden light bathing the range, turning steel into a shimmering promise. He felt a quiet satisfaction. The shot had been perfect, but more importantly, it had been meaningful. Private Herrera approached one last time. "Sir, will we ever see you again?" he asked, hope and uncertainty mixed in his tone. Thomas shook his head slightly. "I don't know," he said softly. "But you'll see it every time you face doubt. You'll remember this range, this shot, and you'll carry it with you. That's enough." With that, Thomas opened the truck door and slid inside. The engine roared to life, a low, steady hum beneath the quiet of the desert. He drove slowly, savoring the final moments at Camp Pendleton, knowing that the lessons had been delivered, the respect earned, and the legend secured. Behind him, the recruits continued their drills. Yet something had changed. Where once there had been laughter at an old man's expense, now there was focus, determination, and inspiration. One of them would carry this lesson into future deployments, another into leadership roles, and yet another into training new recruits. Each would remember the shot, and in remembering, they would pass on its meaning. As the miles stretched between Thomas and the base, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows and turning the sky a deep, bruised purple. He didn't look back. The story, the legend, had taken root. It didn't need him anymore. It belonged to the Marines now, to the Corps, and to anyone willing to learn that discipline, patience, and mastery outlast age, fear, and doubt. And somewhere deep in the desert night, the steel target still gleamed faintly, a silent testament to a single moment when an old veteran reminded the world that the impossible could be done. Not for glory, not for recognition, but for the pure, enduring satisfaction of excellence. Thomas drove on, the road stretching endlessly before him. He felt no need for accolades, no desire for applause. The echoes of his shot, the lessons passed, and the inspiration left behind were enough. He had done what he set out to do, and the Marine Corps would never forget.